The House will now proceed. The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at second reading of Bill C-223 under private members' business.
La question est la suivante.
The question is as follows.
By Mr. Green, moved that Bill C-223, an act to develop a national framework for a guaranteed livable basic income, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Ms. Gazan.
Ms. Gazan.
We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my left who favor the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Madam Hughes.
Madam Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Ashton.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row.
Quatrième.
Fourth row on my left.
Troisième.
Third row on my left.
McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième.
Second row on my left.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Première rangée.
First row on my left.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Singh.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Que tous ceux à ma droite qui
All those on my right in favor of the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
fifth row on my right who support the motion.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Fourth row on my right.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Nakfi.
Mr. Nakfi.
Ms. Damoff.
Ms. Damoff.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Troisième rang.
Third row on my right.
Mr. Area.
Ms. DeBrusen.
Ms. DeBrusen.
Ms. Zarevitz.
Ms. Zerwitz.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur Khoury.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Deuxième.
Second row on my right.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
First row on my right.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Boudris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
Que tous ceux
All those on my left who are opposed to the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Monsieur Blanchette Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchette Jonca.
Madame Behubé.
Madame Bérubé.
cinquième rang.
Fifth row on my left.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Tolmy.
Mr. Tolmy.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Fourth row on my left.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Major.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Third row on my left.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patser.
Mr. Patser.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row on my left.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Abu Taif.
Mr. Abu Taif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Bloch.
Mrs. Bloch.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Première rangée.
First row on my left.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Ms. Lewis, Haldimand, Norfolk.
Miss Lewis, Haldimand, Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Monsieur Saint-Marie.
Monsieur Saint-Marie.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Que tous ceux
All those on my right opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Bain.
Ms. Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Back to Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Mr. Miao.
Mr. Meow.
Mrs. Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
fifth row on my right.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbara.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Third row on my right.
Monsieur Yakino.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Sidhu, Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Third row on my right.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fagascatos.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Deuxième rangée à ma droite.
Second row on my right.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazik.
Première rangée à
First row on my right.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Tassi.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varney.
Ms. Sack.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
la Chambre.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Ended.
If members are not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will now recognize them. I see the honourable member from Willowdale has
Thank
rised.
you, Mr. Speaker. Given my exuberance for Bill C-223, I voted twice in error. I would like my vote to reflect yay. I vote in favor. Thank you.
The honourable member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Chair. I had a problem with the voting app, and I wish to cast a vote as nay.
Nay compte.
The honourable member from Regina Leuven.
I have a problem with the app as well, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to vote nay.
Mr. Stanley. Nay contre.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler les...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 54, 54. Nays contre 273, 273.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the motion defeated.
La Chambre procédera maintenant.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on motion M110 under private member's business in the name of Mr. Essasi.
Question is as follows. Mr. Alsassi, seconded. Mr. Garretson moves that A, the House recognize that 1. Over 20% of food produced in Canada goes uneaten and wasted, costing the Canadian economy tens of billions of dollars. 2. Les personnes, les familles.
2. Individuals, families, and communities across Canada face critical levels of food insecurity.
3. Surplus food unfit for human consumption may serve as animal feed, supporting farmers and reducing national methane emissions. 4. In 2015, the United Nations set sustainable development goals that included a commitment to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. May I dispense? I appreciate that a whole bunch. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically is started. The House will now proceed to the vote. We'll start with the sponsor of the item, Mr. Essasi.
Mr. Essasi.
We will now proceed for members participating in person. All those at my right in favor of the motion, please rise in the 6th row.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Back to Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
5th row.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
4e rangée.
4th row at my right.
Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakono.
Mr. Yakono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Miss Vandenbelt.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Miss May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
3rd row.
Mr. Area.
Mr. Area.
Miss Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Miss O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Garretson.
Mr. Garretson.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Kuzmarachuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Monsieur Elkoury.
Monsieur Elkoury.
In the 2nd row.
Miss Scrow.
Miss Scrow.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpelagia.
Mr. Scarpelagia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Miss Jazik.
Miss Jazik.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss Zarillo.
Miss Zarillo.
In the 1st row at my right.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Mrs. Hutchins.
Mrs. Hutchings.
Miss Tassie.
Miss Tassie.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Monsieur Bouliris.
Monsieur Bouliris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
All those at my left in favor of the motion will please rise in the 6th row. In the 5th row.
Whoops.
In the 4th row. Okay, we'll have to go back. Let's go back to the 6th row.
Madame Hughes.
Madam Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Okay, we sure? Okay, good. In the 5th row. In the 4th row. In the 3rd row.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
In the 2nd row.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
In the 1st row at my left.
Mr. Massing.
Mr. Massey.
Miss Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise. Right, we'll try that again. To my right, opposed to the motion, please rise in the 6th row, in the 5th row, in the 4th row, in the 3rd row, in the 2nd row, in the 1st row. All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise in the 6th row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
In the 5th row.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
In the 3rd row.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse. Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Pupta.
Mr. Van Pupta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Miss Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
In the 3rd row.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
In the 2nd row at my left.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Albultaif.
Mr. Albutaev.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
In the 1st row.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Mr. Saint-Marie.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings. Ended. If members are not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. Personne là, il y a quelqu'un en chambre. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 177, 177. Nays contre 150, 150.
I declare the motion is carried. The House will now proceed with the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at 2nd reading stage of Bill C-378 under private members' business. The question is as follows. Madame Vien, appuyée par Monsieur
Ms. Vien, seconded by Mr. Deltel, moved that Bill C-378, an act amending the Canada Labour Code, complaints by former employees, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities.
Voting electronically has started. The House will now proceed with the vote. Nous commencerons par...
We will begin with the sponsor of the item.
We will now proceed for members participating in person. All those at my left in favor of the motion, please rise in the sixth row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Mr. Blanchet-Jonca.
Madame Birubé.
Madame Birubé.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Canning.
In the fifth row.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
John.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Quatrième rangée.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Miss Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Troisième rangée.
Third row.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
In the second row.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Albultaif.
Mr. Albouteif.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Miss Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
In the first row at my left.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Miss Dancho.
Miss Dancho.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
All those at my right in favor of the motion, please rise in the sixth row.
Miss Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Miss Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Miss Gainey.
Miss Gainey.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row.
Donald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Sidhu Brampton South.
Miss Sue Rampton South.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Quatrième rangée.
Fourth row.
Yakono.
Monsieur Yakono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Miss Vandenbelt.
Miss Vandenbelt.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Miss May Saanich Gulf Islands.
May Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
In the third row.
Miss Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Miss O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Garrettson.
Mr. Garrettson.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. El Khoury.
Second row.
Miss Scrow.
Miss Grove.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpelegia.
Mr. Scarpelegia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Miss Jazek.
Miss Jazzer.
Mr. Desjarlais.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss Zarillo.
Miss Zarillo.
First row at my right.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sargent.
Miss Hutchins.
Miss Hutchins.
Miss Tassie.
Miss Tassie.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Murray.
Miss Murray.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Boleris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise in the 6th row, 5th row, 4th row, 3rd row, 2nd row, and 1st row. And all those at my right opposed to the motion will please rise in the 6th row, 5th row, 4th row, 3rd row, 2nd row, and 1st row. The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings. The electronic voting period has ended. If members weren't able to vote due to technical difficulties, we use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. Monsieur Robillard.
Je vote pour.
Monsieur Robillard. Monsieur Robillard, ton caméra.
Your camera's not on.
On ne te voit pas.
Je vote pour.
Non, on voit l'autre bord de ton ordinateur. Non. Non, Monsieur Robillard, on ne peut pas te voir.
We can't see you.
Essaye de nouveau. Hein?
Try again.
Non, t'as la caméra à l'autre bord de ton ordinateur. T'as allumé là. Mais flip ton téléphone de l'autre bord. Là. OK. OK. On va continuer. Before getting the table to compile the results of the vote, I just want to thank our caller for such a great job, but also to wish him a very happy birthday. Our clerk, Robert Benoit. Robert, I'm going to pay for that, I know I will. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 326, 326. Nays contre 0, aucun.
I declare the motion carried. Accordingly, the bill stands referred to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skill and Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. La Chambre procède maintenant.
The House will now proceed to recorded division, deferred recorded division, for motions at report stage of Bill S-205.
Is on motion number 1. A vote on this motion also applies to motions numbers 2 to 12. Motion number 1. Ms. Ferrari, seconded by Ms. Gray, move that Bill S-205 in Clause 1 be amended. Hey, may I dispense? Thank you so much. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the motion.
Ms. Dancho.
We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my left in favor of the motion, please rise in the 6th row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul.
5th row.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
4th row at my left.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
3rd row.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
2e rangée.
2nd row.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Monsieur Barthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
In the first row,
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
all those at my right in favor of the motion to please rise. In the sixth row, in the fifth row, in the fourth row, in the third row, deuxième rangée.
Second row, first row.
All those at my right opposed to, well, no, this again, on to my left, look this way. All those at my left opposed to the motion, please rise in the sixth row.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Canning.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row.
Quatrième rangée.
Fourth row.
Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Third row.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. Idlow.
Ms. Idlow.
Première rangée à ma gauche.
First row to my right, left, rather.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Monsieur Saint-Marie.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
All those at my right opposed to the motion will please rise in the sixth row.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
Fifth row at my right.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Ms. Said.
Mrs. Zayed.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakino.
Monsieur Yakino.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mrs. Vandenbeld.
Mrs. Vandenbeld.
Monsieur Sanson.
Mr. Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Troisième rangée.
Third row.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May, Cambridge.
Mr. May, Cambridge.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row.
Ms. Scrow.
Miss Scrow.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Ms. Jazek.
Miss Jazek.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
In the first row.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Ms. Hutchings.
Miss Hutchings.
Ms. Tassi.
Miss Tassi.
Ms. Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Ms. Murray.
Miss Murray.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Boudreris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
La Chambre attendra.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings.
The electronic voting period has ended. Si les députés n'ont pas pu voter en raison de problèmes techniques.
If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Oui.
Il dit oui. Il dit oui.
Oui.
Okay, I'll ask him again. Monsieur Robillard, commences tu votes?
Oui. Monsieur Robillard, yé pour.
Quelqu'un d'autre en chambre? No.
Anyone else in the chamber?
Results of the vote.
Yes pour 123, 123. Nays contre 202, 202.
I declare motion number 1 defeated. I there declare motions number 2 to 12 defeated. You want to?
Ms. Dancho, seconded by Mr. Barlow, moves that Bill S-205, an act to amend the criminal code and to make consequential amendments to another act, interim release and domestic violence reconnaissance orders, as amended, be concurred in at report stage. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government.
Mr. Speaker, we request a recorded vote, please.
A 10-minute period for members of voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Ms. Dancho.
We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my left in favour of the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto, St. Paul's.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto, St. Paul's.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Cannings.
Fifth row on my right.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Fourth row on my left.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur Gourde.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
À ma gauche.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième rangée à ma gauche.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Bloch.
Mrs. Bloch.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Et première rangée à ma gauche.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Brock,
Mr. Brock,
Monsieur Deltel,
Monsieur Deltel,
Mrs. Stubbs,
Mrs. Stubbs,
Monsieur Paulus,
Monsieur Paulus,
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk,
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk,
Mr. Barrett,
Mr. Barrett,
Mrs. Gray,
Mrs. Gray,
Mr. Barlow,
Mr. Barlow,
Monsieur Saint-Marie,
Monsieur Saint-Marie,
Monsieur Terrien,
Monsieur Terrien,
Ms. Matheson,
Ms. Matheson.
Que tous ceux à ma droite
All those on my left in favor of the motion will please rise.
à sixième rangée.
Ms. Bradford,
Ms. Bradford,
Madame Diab,
Madame Diab,
Mr. Gahir,
Mr. Gahir,
Madame Lapointe,
Madame Lapointe,
Mr. McDonald Malpeck,
Mr. McDonald Malpeck,
Ms. Thompson,
Ms. Thompson,
Ms. Gainey,
Ms. Gainey,
Cinquième rangée à ma droite.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam,
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam,
Madame Shanahan,
Madame Shanahan,
Mr. Chang,
Mr. Chang,
Mr. Rogers,
Mr. Rogers,
Ms. Yip,
Ms. Yip,
Mr. Van Bynen,
Mr. Van Bynen,
Quatrième rangée à ma droite.
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East,
Mr. Cedar Brampton East,
Mr. Badaway,
Mr. Badaway,
Mr. Sousa,
Mr. Sousa,
Mrs. Atwin,
Mrs. Atwin,
Mr. Sarai,
Mr. Sarai,
Mr. Kellaway,
Mr. Kellaway,
Mrs. Vandenbeld,
Mrs. Vandenbeld,
Monsieur Sanson,
Monsieur Sanson,
Madame Koutrakis,
Madame Koutrakis,
Madame Brière,
Madame Brière,
Mr. Fisher,
Mr. Fisher,
Mr. Long,
Mr. Long,
Mr. Longfield,
Longfield,
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands,
May Saanich Gulf Islands,
Mr. Morris,
Mr. Morris,
Troisième rangée à ma droite.
Mr. Lamoureux,
Mr. Lamoureux,
Mr. Fragascatos,
Mr. Fragascatos,
Mr. Vancouverden,
Mr. Vancouverden,
Mr. Batiste,
Mr. Batiste,
Mr. Kuzmarchuk,
Mr. Kuzmarchuk,
Mr. May, Cambridge,
Mr. May Cambridge,
Monsieur El Khoury,
Monsieur El Khoury,
Deuxième rangée à ma droite.
Ms. Scrow,
Miss Grove,
Mr. McGinty,
Mr. McGinty,
Mr. Casey,
Mr. Casey,
Ms. Sahota,
Miss Sahota,
Madame Petitpas-Taylor,
Madame Petitpas-Taylor,
Ms. Jazek,
Miss Jazek,
Mr. Desjardins,
Mr. Desjardins,
Ms. Zarillo,
Miss Zarillo,
Et première rangée à ma droite.
Mr. Sajan,
Mr. Sajan,
Ms. Hutchings,
Miss Hutchings,
Ms. Tassie,
Miss Tassie,
Ms. Sachs,
Miss Sachs,
Ms. Murray,
Miss Murray,
Monsieur Boulleris,
Monsieur Boulleris,
Mr. Angus,
Mr. Angus,
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
La Chambre... Ah, excuse-moi, je dois poser l'autre question.
Oh, I have to ask the other question.
Opposed to the motion will please rise. Sixth row. Fifth row. Fourth row. Third row. Second row. First row. All those on my right who oppose the motion. Sixth row. Fifth row. Quatrième rangée. Troisième rangée. Deuxième rangée. Première rangée. La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now await the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings. I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Monsieur Robillard. Monsieur Robillard, vous êtes en mode sourdine.
Mr. Robillard, you're on mute.
Je pense qu'il a dit oui, mais...
I think he said yay, but
Vous avez voté.
can I confirm that you voted yay, Mr. Robillard? Yes. Okay, we heard you that time.
I see that the honourable member from Courtney Alberni is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, due to technical difficulties, I wasn't able to vote on my app. I'd like to record a vote of yes. Thank you.
Mr. Johns, yay pour.
D'autres personnes?
Anyone else?
Le bureau.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 323, 323. Nays contre, 1.
Je déclare.
I declare the motion carried.
Time. Now? Now. Ms. Dancho, seconded by Mr. Barlow, moves that Bill S-205, an act to amend the criminal code and to make consequential amendments to another act, interim release and domestic violence reconnaissance orders, be now read a third time and do pass. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to invite a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair, the honourable member from Kildone and St. Paul's. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Ms. Dancho.
Ms. Dancho.
In person, all those to the left in favour of the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Canning.
Cinquième rangée à ma droite.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Quatrième rangée à ma gauche.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur Gourde.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Troisième rangée à ma gauche.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Kana.
Mr. Kana.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième rangée à ma gauche.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Que tous ceux à ma...
All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row.
Quatrième.
Fourth row.
Troisième.
Third row.
Deuxième.
Second row.
Première.
First row.
Que tous ceux à ma droite.
All those at my right opposed to the motion will please rise.
Rangée.
Sixth row. Fifth row. Fourth row. Third row. Second row. First row.
La Chambre attendra.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings. Voting period has ended. If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Robillard.
Oui.
Monsieur Robillard, yea pour.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 321, 321. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the motion carried.
I wish to inform the House that because of the deferred recorded divisions, the government orders will be extended by 92 minutes. Je désire informer la...
I wish to inform the House that due to recorded divisions, government orders will be extended by 92 minutes.
Mais la Chambre que on peut pas
I wish to inform the House that we cannot extend government orders by more than 90 minutes. So, government orders will be extended by 90 minutes.
will be extended by 90 minutes. I see the honourable. Je vois que l'honorable.
I see the honourable member for Outremont rising on a point of order. The honourable member. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As honourable colleagues have done in the past, I seek unanimous consent to change my vote. I wish to change my vote for C-378. I wish to change my vote to be yay in favor, Mr. Speaker.
Voilà, merci. L'honorable député à répéter quel projet de loi.
I ask the honourable member to repeat which vote. My vote on C-378, Mr. Speaker. I wish to vote in favor.
Juste informer la députée.
I wish to inform the member that no members voted against the motion. The vote was unanimous in favor.
Que l'honorable ministre, I see that the honourable minister for Crown Indigenous Relations is, for Crown Indigenous Relations is rising on his feet on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was here just before you announced the last vote. Unfortunately, I wasn't recognized. But I understand the last two votes where I did vote, both in favor, were not registered. I'm just wondering if you could clarify that. And if it's not registered, then I'd like to ask for your consent to be registered as in favor.
Thank the honourable minister. We will check our records. So I'd like to inform the honourable minister that we have one of his votes recorded. That was for the consent stage, but not for, the opposite. It was for third reading, but we need to have your vote recorded. We need to seek unanimous consent of the House to have your other vote considered.
Speaker, if I may seek unanimous consent for my vote on S205 to be registered in favor, please.
All those opposed to the honourable minister moving the motion will please say nay. I'm afraid there is not unanimous consent. I wish to inform the House that the volume of earpieces will now be reset. Members using their earpiece at this time will have to readjust the volume. Je désire informer la Chambre.
I wish to inform members that earpieces will now be reset. Members using earpieces right now will have to reset the volume.
Je vois que l'honorable député et secrétaire parlementaire.
The honourable member and parliamentary secretary is rising on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, I believe that Bill C-205 for the Conservative member for Peterborough Kawartha, and I wish to request a vote in favour of that bill.
On va vérifier si son vote.
We will check the member's vote to see whether it was recorded.
Bien, l'honorable député veut...
The honourable member wishes to seek the unanimous consent of the House.
Elle aimerait demander...
She wishes to seek the unanimous consent of the House to change her vote, to be able to vote in favour of motion 1. May I ask the member to rise to request unanimous consent?
Je vais inviter l'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
I invite the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to come to the table to speak to the clerk, and we will get sorted out. In the meantime...
Alors, je comprends que tout est correct avec l'honorable député de...
All is well for the member for Outremont. We do not need unanimous consent.
Lawrence is rising on a point of order. The honourable member.
Yes, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm seeking unanimous consent of the House to change my vote, which was incorrectly recorded as a no, to a yea on Bill S-205 on the concurrence of the report.
All those opposed to the honourable minister moving the motion will please say nay. Forgive me. For the member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. J'espère que ça va pour tous les députés.
I hope everything's fine. Members are okay with their votes. That's great. Now, government orders. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. Tabling of documents.
You don't have anything? Introduction of government bills. Statements by ministers. Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committee, the honourable member from Winnipeg South Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 69th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee advises that pursuant to Standing Order 91.1 (2), the Subcommittee on Private Members' Business met to consider the items added to the order of precedence on Friday, June 14th, 2024, as well as the orders for the second reading of private members' public bills originating in the Senate, and recommended that the items listed herein, which it has determined should not be designated non-votable, be considered by the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Pursuant to Standing Order 91.1(2), the report is deemed adopted. It is my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. First, the honourable member for Edmonton-Westaskolan. Second, the honourable member for Spadina Fort York on immigration, refugees and citizenship. And third, the honourable member for Courtenay Alberni in regards to health. Introduction of private members' bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. The honourable member, Mr. Morant, seconded by Mr. Albus, moves that the 16th report of the Standing Committee on Finance, presented on Monday, February 26, 2024, be concurred in. Debate. The honourable member from Charleswood, St. James, Mississinaboia, Headingly.
Amazing colleague, the member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. And I just have to say, Mr. Speaker, what an honor it is to rise on behalf of my constituents, the great people of Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingly. Every day I come here, I think about what we can do as members of Parliament to make their lives just a little bit better. And it's also an honor for me, Mr. Speaker, to serve as a member of the Standing Committee on Finance, where I've been for the most part since I was elected in 2019, with a brief stint along the way on the Foreign Affairs Committee. The members of the Finance Committee serve a vital role as the only opposition party focused on holding this Liberal government to account. Mr. Speaker, people are suffering across this land from coast to coast to coast after 9 years of the most incompetent and out-of-touch government in Canadian history. And that's why I think it's very important to point out the extraordinary display of hypocrisy we just saw unfold in this chamber. Just 2 weeks ago, in the throes of the Elmwood-Transcona by-election, the leader of the NDP got up on his feet in front of the cameras, held up a copy of the coalition agreement and said, "I'm ripping it up. I'm done with the Prime Minister. It's over. The gloves are off." And, I can't help but thinking, Mr. Speaker, that, I think they thought they were going to lose that by-election. And so they knew that the Liberals were dragging them down, and so they got up, the leader got up in front of the cameras and he said, "I'm ripping up the coalition agreement." And I'll
Order. There seems to be some conversations going on, and I'm not sure what those conversations are about, but I would ask members to please have those conversations out, because it is interrupting the proceedings. The honourable member for... okay.
Just the extraordinary display of hypocrisy that just occurred in this House, never before seen on a level like that in this House, in the history of this country, in the history of this austere chamber. And what happened? He knew he was going down. We had a great candidate. I was on the doors with him many, many, many times. Colin Reynolds, construction electrician, a guy on the executive of his local IBEW union board, who grew up in the area and really connected with the residents. And so he knew he was going to lose that by-election. So what did he do? I said, "I'm ripping it up. I'm done with the Prime Minister." And unfortunately, the people of Elmwood-Transcona, they deserve better. They deserve better than having the leader of the NDP try to fool them into thinking he is a man of principle. However, he is not, and that was established today, Madam Speaker. In front of the entire country, the man who said, "I'm ripping up the agreement," got up and taped it back together, Madam Speaker. He taped it back together and he got up on his feet and he said, "I believe in this Prime Minister. I'm voting with this Prime Minister." In fact, he said, "I have confidence in the Prime Minister." The height of hypocrisy is on a level never, as I said, never ever before seen on the floor of this chamber. And Canadians won't forget it, and the people of Elmwood-Transcona won't forget it come the next election. Now, on the issue of this report, Madam Speaker, as I said, I sit on that committee. Conservatives really are the only members on that committee that are doing their best to hold the government to account. And we had some great ideas for the report that our other colleagues from other parties on the committee would not support. And so for the people watching, we attached a dissenting report to the report, which we're allowed to do, and anyone who wants to look it up online, they can read the dissenting report. But I wanted just to go through some parts of it. But before I do, I also want to just circle back for a second, just to look at part of the Liberal government's record. In 2015, in order to fool Canadians into voting for him, the Prime Minister promised to balance the budget by 2019. And of course, that never happened. In fact, he doubled the national debt in 9 years. That's right, it doubled. It's hard to get your head around that, for people to get their heads around that, Madam Speaker, but just to put it in perspective, in 2015, when the Prime Minister first was elected to office, the national debt was $616 billion. Today, it's over $1.2 trillion. He has spent more in debt than all other prime ministers from 1867 to today combined. Today, the interest on that debt is $52 billion a year, more than we spend on health care, more than we spend on defense, and in fact, more than we actually collect in the GST. And so it's important for people watching to know that when they go out and they buy something in the store, and the store adds on the GST, that money is going directly to paying the interest on the massive historic debt that this Prime Minister has managed to rack up. And so at committee, Conservatives made a number of common sense recommendations that were rejected by the NDP and Liberal members. And one of the recommendations we made at committee, Madam Speaker, which we had hoped would be a recommendation in the report, was to axe the carbon tax. And the reason we wanted to axe the carbon tax is pretty straightforward, and I'll go through some of those points, Madam Speaker. You know, we had, for example, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, who came to committee and told us that the carbon taxes are inflationary, and that by cutting the carbon tax, inflation would come down by 0.6%, bringing CPI back into the bank's target range. Now, the government has had an opportunity to start with the government has an opportunity now to start with the carbon tax on farmers. Our common sense conservative Bill C-234 last year as part of the finance committees, or earlier this year as part of the Mayor Cam Guthrie from Guelph at committee, and I asked him, I said, he was elected in 2014. I said, the year you were elected, Mayor Guthrie, how many homeless encampments were there in Guelph? He said, 0. I said, well, how many are there today? He said, 20. That's just $1 billion on the National Housing Strategy. Never before has so much been spent to achieve so little, Madam Speaker. It's time to axe the failed and inflationary carbon tax that makes gas, groceries, and home heating more expensive, and to bring down inflation so that Canadians can once again earn powerful paychecks so that they can afford nutritious food and a home in a safe neighborhood. It seems like a simple ask, part of the Canadian dream, but that dream has been broken by the failed policies of this Liberal government. And we said there should be we said to axe the tax, and we also talked about building more homes, Madam Speaker. There's a housing crisis in this country. Time flies when you're having fun. I see I'm just down to 1 minute. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We need to build more homes in this country. Again, we have a housing crisis. We have an affordability crisis. We need to build millions of homes, and the Liberals and the NDP voted against our common sense conservative bill, the Building Homes Not Bureaucracy Act. They voted against it, a bill that would have got those houses built, but instead they just got in the way. They are the gatekeepers of this House of Commons. They got in the way of a common sense bill that would help Canadians, and of course we need to fix the budget and we need to stop the crime. Let's bring it home, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And you know, as we're listening, the Conservatives never missed the opportunity to actually work for Canadians, Madam Speaker. We were supposed to be discussing Bill C-71 tonight, which is Lost Canadians. Those that this Conservative government, when they were in power, actually stripped the ability of Canadians to retain or gain their citizenship. And I actually wanted to debate this bill tonight because it affects my daughter, who was born abroad and has lived here all of her life, in actually ensuring that her children have Canadian citizenship. So I asked the member, why is it that we have to hear the same slogans over and over and over again, rather than doing the work that we're doing on this side of the House for Canadians?
The honourable member Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Well, I will agree with the member on one point. She said that Conservatives never cease to work for Canadians, and in fact, that is absolutely correct. We will never cease to work for Canadians, and that's exactly what we're doing right now. And I will take no lessons from a member who literally was holding hands with Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah less than a year ago after what happened on October 7th.
The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my colleague for their speech and all the work he does at the Finance Committee. Well, we're talking about the pre-budgetary consultation report that was printed last February. Well, then there was the government budget, and I'd like to ask my colleague if he finds the budget presented last spring was Did it really reflect what we heard at the consultations and the report we presented?
Boy Headingley.
Well, as I said, Conservatives tabled a dissenting report, and that report was based on testimony that we heard from many witnesses at committee that said that the carbon tax was just a terrible policy that was making life harder for everyone, that we needed to take tangible steps to build more homes, that the budget was out of control, and in fact, the budgetary spending was the actual cause for spiking inflation and making everything more expensive for everyone. And we heard testimony that we needed to bring in things like mandatory minimum sentences and consecutive sentences in order to help stem the tide of crime in this country. So the reason those things are in a dissenting report is for the very reason my colleague mentions, is that our colleagues in the Liberal and NDP party on the committee would not agree to listen to what the witnesses said.
And comments? The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni. Oh, sorry, I have a point of order. The honourable minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Madam Chair, thank you. I'd like to take a point of personal privilege with regards to the member and his comments to me. With regards to my government work that I did abroad, I am a Canadian citizen and an Israeli citizen who's dedicated my life to 30 years in peace building. And he took a
yeah. I would just say that that is more a point of debate than it is a point of privilege. The honourable member, point of order, the honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
I think actually the minister has a point, that she simply asked the member a question in relation to what he said on the floor of the House of Commons, and he went and took the time to insult my colleague. That is totally unacceptable, Madam Speaker, and it should be that he should be apologizing to the House.
Sorry, this is all part of debate, and I do want to remind members to be careful on the wording. This has caused a bit of disorder, and so I just want to remind members to please be careful on what they're saying in the House. I'm sorry, I don't recognize individuals that are not in their chairs. So now we go to questions and comments. The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Colleague talked about the by-election in Elmo-Transcona, and he talked about small business people. Madam Speaker, for 7 years, the NDP led the charge to cap credit card merchants' fees and forced this government to do something. The Conservatives, Madam Speaker, they sat silent for 7 years, while small business people paid some of the highest credit card fees in the world, Madam Speaker. Layla Dance, who won Elmo-Transcona, who ran the Transcona Business Improvement Association, the reason she won is because small business people saw right through the fact that the Conservatives are actually just there for big corporations, Madam Speaker. So my question through you is, why were the Conservatives silent and standing up for Visa and MasterCard instead of small business owners in this country?
Honourable member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
That's pretty rich, Madam Speaker, from a member whose party voted with a government that spiked inflation higher than it's ever been before, quicker than it's ever been before, making everything more expensive. And as much as they like to talk about how inflation has come down to the 2% target, the damage has been done. Everything is more expensive. So good on him for taking on credit card interest, but the reality is that the policies he supported were seriously detrimental to affordability in this country, and Canadians are suffering now because of that.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Speaker, and it's always a pleasure and an honor to rise on behalf of the good people of Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola, and I'm very proud to be sharing this time with the previous member. Madam Speaker, the Finance Committee has a very important job. In fact, it's rare because in our standing orders it actually says that the Finance Committee must travel and hear widely from Canadians as it does its deliberations. But Madam Speaker, as we've heard from the leader of the Conservative of Canada's Common Sense Conservatives, Canada does have a problem. We have a gatekeeper economy, Madam Speaker. And a gatekeeper economy means, Madam Speaker, that there are many people that are seeking prosperity, seeking opportunity, but cannot do so because of the various gatekeepers that are closing in. And Madam Speaker, as a member of the Finance Committee, a previous member of the Finance Committee, I should say, I took great pride in the effort to try to hear testimony when we travel to sometimes remote locations, Madam Speaker. But one of the key problems we do have is that for the average citizen, let's call them, John Smith or Jane Doe, for the average individual, Madam Speaker, they don't have a lobbyist here in Ottawa. And oftentimes, it's actually lobbyists that are the ones that are coming to the Finance Committee. And the number one recommendation they are always making, Madam Speaker, is to spend more money. Now, when we talk about the costly coalition of an NDP Liberal, sometimes supported by the Bloc, but mainly the NDP Liberal government, Madam Speaker, it's because there is never a dollar that they could not find something to spend on. In fact, Madam Speaker, let's go harken back to the first majority that this government had. The Treasury Board president at the time said, we're going to do a spending review. And Madam Speaker, the spending review that they did came back that actually found that they needed to spend more money. That's the kind of situation where we have, Madam Speaker, no leadership, no priority except to spend others' money. In fact, Madam Speaker, when I speak about this issue, often I refer that Ottawa, in terms of the government, has a spending problem. It doesn't have a revenue problem. Yet there isn't a tax that this government won't look to increase. Every April 1st, we see a hodgepodge of different taxes, starting with the carbon tax. And Madam Speaker, it doesn't matter what province you are from, the exception of Quebec, Madam Speaker. Every April 1st, we see, again, an NDP government, our NDP Liberal government raising the carbon tax. In fact, if you go to the BC NDP government's own budget documents, on page 75, they actually say the federal government is responsible for us having to raise our carbon tax. Now, Madam Speaker, I want to just take a quick moment to point out that the members for Foothills has actually asked the government about carbon tax 1 and carbon tax 2. Yes, there is a series of regulations that have ended up, and of course they've been fully costed by both the government and the Parliamentary Budget Office. But the government's own analysis, Madam Speaker, is each one respectively combined is a tax on the economy of up to, if not higher than, $40 billion per year. Let's be mindful that the leader of the NDP has always advocated for more taxes to come to Ottawa. He's talked about not supporting carbon taxes, but we shall see, Madam Speaker, because he also talked about not supporting this Liberal Prime Minister anymore. In fact, he famously now tore up, I'm tearing up the agreement, Madam Speaker, for confidence and supply. And he said that the Prime Minister shouldn't be Prime Minister. And yet, Madam Speaker, he comes to this place today, and what did the NDP leader and his caucus do? They supported this government. So, Madam Speaker, it'd be really interesting to see what happens April 1st of next year, where we have things like the carbon tax set to increase. We have things like excise tax on alcohol, Madam Speaker. We'll see what happens at that particular juncture. But, Madam Speaker, I'm going to go back to the gatekeeping economy and the lobbyists and whatnot. Madam Speaker, they always come and they present something. When I speak to my constituents, they are talking in terms of that they're barely able to keep on with what they have, whether that be affording, nutritious food. Sylvain Charlebois, the food professor at Dalhousie, has said that people are making the very difficult choice between nutritious food and the cost, and they're more siding with the cost. We should be concerned, Madam Speaker. We should be concerned that many of our constituents are going to food banks because they cannot afford to pay their carbon tax, their income tax, Madam Speaker, all the taxes that this government continues to raise. So, Madam Speaker, we also, who speaks for those people, Madam Speaker? They don't have a lobbyist. We are supposed to speak for them. We are the ones who are ultimately responsible for either giving the government supply or denying it. So again, we had a confidence vote today where we saw both the Bloc and the NDP side with the Liberal government. Now, Madam Speaker, I believe that we need to be looking more to our constituents rather than the recommendations of lobbyists that show up at the Finance Committee and others. So, Madam Speaker, we also need to consider that our average, again, John Smith or Jane Doe, especially if they're younger, are having critical shortages of housing. Now, this Liberal government has said every single fall economics update and every budget, oh, this is the big thing and we're going to address that. Madam Speaker, they have not. They have not addressed things like chronic homelessness. They have not addressed the fact that young people cannot get into the market even when they save and scrimp to get there, Madam Speaker. They keep talking about all the different programs that they offer and how that's going to alleviate the system. But again, Madam Speaker, going back to that gatekeeper economy, we have it where many municipalities, particularly in those large urban centers, yes, I'm talking about the census metropolitan areas, where people, city councillors, are choosing not to build housing in sufficient quantities. And Madam Speaker, this is caused where, again, if you have a massive demand for housing, which has only gone up and due to the policies of this government, Madam Speaker, if we continue to allow gatekeepers, such as municipal councils, to basically stop the investment of new housing, in BC, in the past year, we've seen housing starts drop by 34%. Madam Speaker, that is going to create an affordability challenge, a crisis again. This government and politicians that support it constantly talk about the housing crisis, and yet there's very little discussion about putting pressure on municipalities. In fact, Madam Speaker, the government's own housing, so-called housing accelerator, I called it a slush fund for municipalities. They are essentially allowing municipalities, writing them checks for not increasing housing stock. Even in Kelowna, which a part of my riding is in Kelowna, if you actually read through the Housing Accelerator plan, Madam Speaker, it actually talks about that they can actually invest the dollars that they're given from it in things like bike lanes and bridges and sewers. There's no onus on the city of Kelowna to help build a single house. There's not an actual commitment for that. So, Madam Speaker, this is the problem. We have a government that fails to acknowledge that municipal councils are those gatekeepers, instead of putting up a set of incentives that actually reward those who are building and punishing those that are not. They've essentially written out blank checks to these municipalities, Madam Speaker. And you know what? They also have been picking winners and choosers. I know the city of West Kelowna Summerland, the District of Summerland, District of Peachland, all applied for the same funding. Madam Speaker, didn't get anywhere with this government. So again, this scattershot approach, Madam Speaker, is not working. And again, it's those young people that I want to focus on, because all of us here love this country. I really believe that we do. But the problem is if we continue to deliver the same kind of results, Madam Speaker, those young people are going to feel alienated, and they're going to either opt out, not vote, or they're going to vote for very extreme choices. Now, the member for Carleton, Madam Speaker, as I've said before, has been adamant that he and our party will build the homes. So, Madam Speaker, on this concurrence debate, we need to discuss more about, again, axing the tax. We need to build more homes. I wish I could get to fix the budget and stopping the crime, Madam Speaker, but I'm running out of time. Thank you. Looking forward to questions in this chamber.
And comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
So thank you, Madam Speaker. And sadly, we see the Conservative Party continues to want to play the game of filibustering, and at a significant expense. The real people that the Conservative Party is actually penalizing by this behavior is actually Canadians. Canadians are feeling the impact of a Conservative opposition party that continues to feel entitled to thrive for their thirst for power and filibustering government legislation to the degree they won't even allow it to go to committee. Does the member not recognize that the official opposition does have a role to play, that it also assist and can help Canadians?
The member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Speaker, because we do not agree with this government's agenda, that's called a democracy where people can disagree. And I would also just disagree with the whole statement that the government thinks that it has the right issues today. Madam Speaker, my constituents are talking about the unaffordability of just being able to pay their bills, Madam Speaker. They want to see us axe the tax. They also want to see us talk about housing. Madam Speaker, it's politicians that say there's a crisis and then they do nothing about it. In fact, they talk about other things. Madam Speaker, the common sense Conservatives, we are the party that will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. Madam Speaker, those are the priorities of my constituents.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech, and he's a colleague that I have the pleasure of working together with on the Finance Committee and have for some months now. At the beginning of his speech, he said that the government was spendthrift. And one of the things the government spends the most on is supporting the fossil fuel industries like oil and natural gas. For example, there's the Trans Mountain Pipeline that costs $34 billion. And there's also the carbon capture and nuclear plants in the oil sands that's used there. So $83 billion plus $23 billion. So does my colleague like me believe that that spending should be cut back? The Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question from the bloc. In politics, I give my support where the government taxes the correct amount.
For example, this member at Finance Committee raised legitimate questions about the so-called luxury tax, a tax on workers that actually we had industry come in and say this will harm the industry and we will push business to the United States and to other places. So that's a policy that I 100% agree with my Bloc Québécois member. Madam Speaker, I would also suggest that he may want to take a look at l'Énergie de West.
Western energy, particularly natural gas.
Home province of British Columbia, Madam Speaker. We could be doing good things on the environment and the economy. We can be helping displace dirty coal right across the whole country, across the whole world, Madam Speaker. These are some of the things we should have discussions about, and I hope that we will with this gentleman and his party in the future.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Madam Speaker, my honourable colleague spoke about the #1 issue being affordability for his constituents. I can tell you that's the same issue that I've heard in my riding of Vancouver Kingsway. We come from the same province. Now, the NDP has addressed that in a number of ways, and one of the ways we did that was by bringing in dental care for 9 million people so that the thousands of dollars that someone would have to pay on dental care out of their pocket would no longer be the case for them. We also brought in pharmacare, and we know with diabetes medication, I've talked to many, many people who have to spend thousands of dollars every year on diabetes medications and devices. Can he explain to us, if he's truly concerned about affordability, why he and his party voted against those two measures, which take thousands of dollars of expenses off some of the most low-income Canadians in Canada, which would obviously ease their affordability issues? Why did he oppose that?
Wasn't far from a brief question. The honourable member for South Okanagan, Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola. A brief answer, please.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I'll give the member a practical example. My understanding is in the Similkameen and in Penticton proper, there has not been any sign-ups for a dentist. Maybe there has been one now, Madam Speaker. But for the NDP to be touting that this program is widely available and accessible to people, Madam Speaker, I've had people in Kelowna that have told me that they've tried to go to a different dentist, but the new dentist requires a numbers of x-rays that cost hundreds of dollars, Madam Speaker, and they cannot afford that. So, Madam Speaker, this member may believe his own rhetoric, but when you actually talk to the people that are trying to access the so-called dental program, they can't. Madam Speaker, it is smoke and mirrors, and many people have phoned me specifically because they know I'm a conservative and they want that feedback heard on the House of Commons floor.
I don't think that was a brief answer either, but it's okay. I think it was about the same amount of timing. So questions and resuming debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm hoping to be able to address the motion that's been brought forward as liberally as both the mover and the seconder have addressed the motion in terms of all over the place in regards to the government agenda and some of the things that the Conservative Party of Canada would like to be able to do. Madam Speaker, you know, it's interesting. We just finished having a confidence vote. And the Conservatives Party of Canada, in their great thirst or hunger for power, will do whatever it takes, period, end of story, in order to get what they want, not necessarily what Canadians want, Madam Speaker, what the leadership of the Conservative Party wants. And it's unfortunate because there is a substantial cost to the behavior that we are witnessing day in and day out from the Conservative Party. Their single focus is nothing more than to cause an election. Fortunately, other political entities in the House of Commons today recognize that we are not here to serve the Conservative Party. We are here to serve and provide for Canadians in all regions of our country, Madam Speaker. And I truly believe that in the last election, all parties were given a mandate. And that mandate, Madam Speaker, was to work cooperatively in looking for ways in which we can provide the type of supports that Canadians want to see and expect, not only of the government of the day or the Liberals, but also from the New Democrats, members of the Bloc, and, in fact, Conservative members of the House of Commons. I can tell you that the Conservative Party has been consistent since day one after the last federal election. All one needs to do is to take a look in terms of the actions that they have taken. And it has been greatly amplified over the summer, to the degree in which they're getting even a little bit giddy, I would suggest to you, Madam Speaker. Unfortunately, I would have to add to that giddiness that there is some serious issues that are flowing out of the leader of the Conservative Party's office. And that really concerns a lot of Canadians. Because what we have witnessed is a Conservative Party shift to the right, to the extreme right, where we have even seen progressive Conservative prime ministers be exceptionally critical of the new Reform Conservative Party that we see today. I'll do more than one. I can name three. Joe Clark, Kim Campbell, and Brian Mulroney. All three of them have been critical of today's Conservative Reform Party. Joe Clark will tell you that he never left the Progressive Conservative Party. This party left him. And I can tell you that Brian Mulroney is on the record of saying that this Conservative Party has amputated the progressive nature of the Conservative Party. Some of the stuff that Kim Campbell says is unparliamentary, so I won't tell you what Kim Campbell has to say, in particular about the leader of the Conservative Party. The Conservative right that is so heavily influenced by the mega movement coming out of the States and the types of things that we're seeing in the States, Madam Speaker, that Canadians do not support or like, or in good part are in fear. There's a very negative side to politics, that state side that Canadians do not like. And it's interesting, we had a vote today. And I can tell you, here's the type of information that goes out. I don't know how they got a specific email address that gets funneled to me, but here we are having a vote on the confidence motion. And the Conservatives lose it. They didn't get what they wanted. Within minutes, an email goes out because I actually received the email, Madam Speaker. And I don't know how it is my name got on it. I suspect it's got to be a fairly extensive list. But here's one of the quotes directly from the email from the Conservative Party of Canada. Blank, I'll let you fill in the name, is spineless, he's a fake, a phony, a fraud, and a liar. Madam Speaker, these are very strong words. And this is something in which the Conservative Party of Canada today is sending out to literally, I suspect, millions of Canadians. I have no idea how I ended up on this list, and we'll see if using their AI, they're going to find out how I did, Madam Speaker. But I can tell you, it's not the first one I got in the last few days. And at the very end, what do they want? They want me to donate, Madam Speaker. Oh, don't worry, I will not be donating. I can tell you, it's easy to resist it. But the Conservative Party today is all about misinformation. It's about negative as bottom, as low as you can get into the gutter, they'll go. At least the leadership of their office of the Conservative Party today. They don't have any problem in terms of going low. In fact, Madam Speaker, you know, a couple of weeks back, I can't really recall when it was, I was on a CTV panel, and there was no Conservative representative, and I'm told, well, they kind of don't want to participate in panels. And yesterday I was on a CBC panel, and they don't participate on CBC panels. And then yesterday, the leader of the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party has made a decision. They don't like CBC and CTV. So now, as one of them says, here, you know, so now, Madam Speaker, they're saying we don't want to be accountable through media like the CTVs of Canada or the CBCs because they don't have confidence in those national news broadcasters, Madam Speaker. Because they don't want to answer the questions that are being posed to them. Instead, Madam Speaker, they want to rely on social media. You know, there's some reference to the leader of the Conservative Party being very similar to Trump. Well, that might be a bit of a disservice to Donald Trump. Quite frankly, Madam Speaker, I am very disappointed in the way and the direction that the far-right Conservative Party is going today, and there's no sign in terms of them changing their attitudes. Now, take that attitude of hate that they're actually promoting that's out there, Madam Speaker, and look at the information that they're providing. Today, they bring forward a motion, and that motion is in keeping with their slogans. I'll give them that much. Darn, they're good at slogans, Madam Speaker. They got slogans, they got bumper stickers, they're ready, they're itching, they want to get out there, Madam Speaker. But the problem is it's all based on a foundation of sand. At the end of the day, there's nothing to it but slogans and bumper stickers. And it's supported by misinformation. And the best example I could give, or one of the examples I could give, is likely what they've been talking a lot about already today. You know, find out how many, if you do a Hansard search, how many Conservative members of Parliament have actually said anything about cutting the carbon rebates, Madam Speaker? I suspect you won't find any of them. Now tell me how many you think have said cut the carbon tax. I suspect on average each one has said it 10 times. That's on average. Some have said it a couple hundred times, others haven't said it because they haven't spoken. But I can suggest to you, Madam Speaker, when they go to Canadians and they say, we're going to save, as they have said inside the chamber, we're going to save Canadians money by cutting the carbon tax, that's not true. More than 80% of the constituents in which I represent, more than 80%, they get a carbon rebate. That rebate amount is more than the carbon tax that they pay. That means their net income, disposable income, is increased. That's the reality. You don't have to believe me. The parliamentary budget officer, who's independent, will tell you that, Madam Speaker. But they'll go around and they will say misinformation because it sounds good. Some provinces don't even have the carbon tax, yet they'll go to those provinces and say, we're going to cut the carbon tax, and give a false impression. The other day in debate, Madam Speaker, I had one member that on the Conservative Party that stood up and he said, well, you know, 34% is the cost increases on food as a direct result of the carbon tax. What a bunch of garbage. That's absolutely ridiculous, Madam Speaker. I challenged the member on that statement, and then I challenged a couple of other members on the statement that that particular member said. They don't change their opinions on it. Even if they're confronted with facts, Madam Speaker, they don't change their opinions because they are so focused. They are so focused on that thirst for power. At the end of the day, they're not concerned about what's happening for Canadians in the day-to-day livings that Canadians have to put up with, let alone the important issues that the House of Commons deals with on a daily basis. Today, we're supposed to be debating Bill C-71. Bill C-71 is a bill to ensure that individuals will be given their Canadian citizenship that should never have lost their citizenship. Every political party, except for the Conservatives, actually support that legislation. They don't even want to debate it, Madam Speaker, now. They won't allow it to be debated. They don't want it to go to committee. But you say, well, that Conservatives don't support that one. Well, Bill C-66 they support. They say that they support it. That takes sexual harassment victims and rape victims that are going through military courts, transferring that into civil courts. Every member of the House of Commons, Conservatives, Bloc, New Democrats, Greens, and of course Liberals, we all support that legislation. You would think the Conservatives would allow that bill to go to committee, but no. Instead, they want to filibuster. They bring forward another concurrence report. They say they're concerned about the economy. Take a look at Bill C-33 that we were supposed to be debating last week. To enhance our trading opportunities. And what does the Conservative Party do? No, we don't want to debate that either. Let's bring in another concurrence report, preventing the government from being able to debate that legislation. Members opposite, in criticizing the government today, were talking about issues of crime, and they say that's what they want to talk about. I remind them about Bill C-63, Online Harms Act. That's there to protect children being extorted, being bullied, and the whole issue of exploitation of our young children. We were supposed to debate that last week, but no. The Conservatives said no to that too, Madam Speaker, and brought forward a concurrence report. The Conservative Party is going out of its way in order to prevent any legislation from going to committee. It was interesting, prior to getting up, I had a member of one of the opposition parties approach me saying, why don't we just move to orders of the day? And I think there's a great deal of effort, a thought, to move towards orders of the day, because then maybe we can get on with actually providing movement on some of this legislation. The problem is that we're a minority government. In a minority government, we can't go to orders of the day unless we get an opposition party that says, hey, look, we will support the government moving to orders of the day so we can get rid of the games that the Conservative Party is playing. Let there be no doubt, no matter how critical the Conservative Party is, how much of a roadblock that they want to put in, no matter how much of a character assassination that they're after in regards to the government, Madam Speaker, this Prime Minister, this government will continue to be focused on the interests of Canadians in all regions of our country. That is something in which we will continue to be day in and day out. And that means, whether the Conservatives want it or not, we will continue to develop policy ideas that will transform into budgetary measures and legislative measures. And there will come a time when Canadians will, in fact, evaluate and take a look in terms of what it is that the Conservative Party has been doing between now and whenever the next election is, and what it is that other political entities have done. I think that there is a sense of responsibility for all of us in order to be able to accomplish good things for Canadians. That's what I liked about the agreement that was achieved between the Liberals and the New Democrats. I have always been a big fan of the Pharmacare plan, Madam Speaker. I've always been a very strong advocate for a national healthcare system that supports our provinces that administer healthcare. For over 30 years as a parliamentarian, those are the types of issues that have been important for me. And I can tell you, as a government, it's been important for us. And we were able to get the support from the New Democrats to advance a number of wonderful healthcare initiatives. And that's what it means, Madam Speaker, in terms of putting people first. putting the constituents of Canada ahead of partisan politics. By doing that, this government has invested $198 billion, Madam Speaker, in over 10 years in health care. That's for future generations, Madam Speaker. We have developed a dental care program that is, to date, over 700,000 people have had access to, Madam Speaker. Think in terms of diabetes. Think in terms of contraceptives, and how as a government working with an opposition party, we are in fact making a difference. In fact, I've suggested one of the other things we should be looking at is the possibility of shingles, and how a pharmacare might be able to deal with that particular issue, Madam Speaker. These are the types of ideas that we're talking about within the Liberal Party, wanting to build a stronger, healthier healthcare system, Madam Speaker, while the Conservative Party wants to tear it down. That's a part of the Conservative far-right hidden agenda, Madam Speaker, and people need to be aware of that. And by the time we get to the election, I believe that throughout that election, we will see the Conservative sand fade away. There is no foundation to what they're saying. That it's just the bumper stickers and the slogans. That's all they have, Madam Speaker. Contrast that to the many progressive measures we have taken as a government, and in good part because of a cooperation of opposition parties, Madam Speaker. I ask the Conservatives to stop playing the games. Stop bringing in the Conservative motions of concurrence and allow debate on government legislation, Madam Speaker. A responsible Conservative opposition can still bring in the motions that they want, but at least allow the debates to occur on legislation. Allow these important pieces of legislation to go to committee where they can be studied, where they can come back, where they can provide hope for many, Madam Speaker. That's the very least the Conservatives can do. Put Canadians ahead of your own political party. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people from Kamloops Thompson Caribou. And before I begin my question, I just want to wish my mother a very happy birthday. Madam Speaker, I just don't know where to start. This is a member who talks about wasting House resources. I believe he has probably spoken more than every single member on that side combined. I have seen him repeatedly stand up when there are strong women sitting in front of him, behind him, around him, and he repeatedly stands up. This is a feminist government, they say. Talk to Jody Wilson-Raybould. Talk to Jane Philpott. Talk to the finance minister in a year or two. This government is unbelievable in their hypocrisy. He talks about us being negative. All he did was talk negatively. If he wants to change politics in Canada, he should look in the mirror.
Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Well, Madam Speaker, I think that if we recognize, as I'm sure the member opposite does, that when it comes to legislation, that if every member of the Conservative Party wanted to stop legislation, all they have to do is just stand up and speak, and you can go from one member to the next member to the next member. You have 100 members. You could kill all legislation. I recognize that the official opposition as an opposition party has a lot of tools in which it can actually go to the toolbox to prevent legislation from passing. Good for them. But at the end of the day, I wish they would start thinking about not what's in the best interest of the Conservative Party of Canada, but rather what's in the best interest of Canadians. And I truly believe that if they started to do that, we would see more things taking place in a positive fashion on the floor of the House of Commons. And I can assure the member opposite, my critique of the opposition party and their leader doesn't even come even close to the type of behavior that we witness coming from the Conservative ranks over across the aisle.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, when I was elected 5 years ago, I remember my first day of work. I was impressed by the energy, the passion, and also I was impressed by the decibel level that my colleague from Winnipeg North can reach when he speaks in this place, and he hasn't disappointed today. Now, It's been 5 years since that I've been an MP, and the member for Winnipeg North answers questions very precisely. He doesn't avoid answering questions, and I really appreciate that about him. We are now discussing the Finance Committee report. The Bloc Québécois has a proposal that we need to increase OAS for 65 to 74-year-olds. And we need to review our indexing so that it can take into account salaries in Canada. So I have a simple question. I know my colleague will impress me with a simple answer. Does he support our proposal?
After saying those kind words, I don't want to disappoint the member of the Bloc Party. I can say that much. I do know in less than an hour we're going to actually be debating a very important motion that the Bloc are bringing forward, and I will be able to hopefully expand on a more detailed response. But suffice to say for now, if we take a look at what it is that the government has proposed and done for seniors in Canada over the last number of years, the one that I would highlight, because I know this is the one he's most interested in, is the issue of 75 plus and OAS. In a federal election platform, we actually made the commitment to increase, excuse me, individuals, seniors 75 plus, and the reason for that is we need to recognize that the needs of someone that's 75 plus is greater. I'm thinking in terms of medical expenses as an example, and the ability to be able to generate that supplementary income along with the shrinking.
Sorry, the honourable member's time is up. I've been trying to signal to him. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, just for the folks at home, so they completely understand that we're doing this concurrence debate on a Finance Committee report, a pre-budget report for a budget that's already passed. So if people at home are wondering what's going on, we're spending $70,000 an hour approximately because the Conservatives have decided to block, Madam Speaker, block debating legislation that's going to help people, block debate on the capital gains increases, Madam Speaker. Why? Because the highest income earners of 1.5% of tax filers with the total income over $250,000, they're going to receive 61% of the individual capital gains. That's why. They're here protecting their friends, Madam Speaker. But I'll ask my colleague. He says he always supported pharmacare and dental care, but he voted against it both times before it came forward.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, on that particular point, I can recall shortly after my daughter getting elected back, I guess back in 2015, 2016, being out on Keewatin Street and taking the signs and having a wonderful story about pharmacare. I used to be the health critic for many years, or for a couple of years anyway, when I was in the Manitoba legislature. It's something in which I believe should be in there, and I'm glad that we're able to work together to ensure that we have programs like pharmacare moving forward. In regards to C71, Madam Speaker, C71, I know one of his colleagues has been a very strong advocate for it. The NDP have actually attempted to get C71 through the House, and even last fall, I think it was all the way through, Madam Speaker, recognizing the importance of the bill. And we appreciate the support that we do receive from opposition members, because we need that kind of support in order to be able to get things passed. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments on the Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader. Oh, sorry, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
That's not a job I want. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to echo the comments from the member from Courtenay Alberni about the ridiculous nature of this debate and the cost of Canadian taxpayers on it. However, it does give us a chance to talk about some of the important elements of the government's work. I'm wondering if the member from Winnipeg North could talk a little bit more about the dental care plan, because it is one of those areas where I believe the NDP likes to take credit for it. However, we're willing to share credit for it. We think it's one of those examples of when Parliament can work well, and I'm wondering if the member could offer some comments on that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
There is such a keen interest to ensure that this program continues to grow and survive, and we want to make sure that everyone is ultimately receiving that particular benefit. Take a look at the numbers, Madam Speaker, and in order for that to achieve, I think we've got to bring it through past spring, Madam Speaker, and then we'll be able to see all Canadians having access to it. But to give you a sense, imagine 750,000 patients already, 2.4 million approvals, 21,000 providers or dentists, if you like, Madam Speaker. That's an incredible take-up on a wonderful program. That program is there because there's a sense of cooperation, and a lot of good people, in particular within the Liberals and the New Democrats, wanted to see that program. We got to be there to ensure that it stays there, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? We have time for one more question. The
Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. For the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, I'd like to go back to the question asked by my friend, the member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Like he has said, we're talking about C389. It's also in the report we're talking about. With the support of Liberals, we want to say that we're in favor of this measure. We need royal assent for C319, and the Parliamentary Secretary represents the government. Can he commit to giving it, yes or no?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, what I would say, because I realize I got very limited time, I will get a chance a little bit later to add some more thoughts on the issue. But for now, to say that seniors, we love our seniors, and as a government, virtually from day one, dramatic increases to the GIS to ensure that we could actually support our seniors, literally lifted hundreds of thousands of seniors out of poverty by that one policy initiative in itself. Fast forward, go into the pandemic. And during the pandemic, the payments, the one-time payments that were given to seniors. Fast forward to literally the millions and millions that we provide towards programming that ultimately is there to support seniors in all the different regions of the country. I believe as a government, both past and hopefully going forward, we'll be able to continue these types of supports for our seniors. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's with great surprise that I learned that this afternoon, beginning of the evening, talk about the Standing Committee on Finance report on pre-budgetary consultation that was presented last February. It was presented last February, but the work essentially took place last fall. There was a great number of hours spent at committee where we received many witnesses that represented almost all of the aspects of our economy, obviously that of Quebec and Canada. We even did a tour of various provinces during the 2-week break week in October of 2023. We went to the Maritimes, and in November, we toured Quebec up to British Columbia. You really have to get on the ground to take the pulse of the population, and the witnesses there took place in our discussions, and they told us about our needs and realities, and this made it easier for us to do our work to better understand what's happening. Well, you could say, what does a bloc member want in terms of listening to groups in other provinces? Well, first, all needs, well, there may be some overlap with those of Quebec in terms of needs in general. And all organizations that defend the rights of Francophones in Canada have to be heard as well. So it allows us to create contacts and understand their reality and hear how isolated they are and how they have to fight to continue to speak both official languages. There's a lot of work that has to be done still, and we want to show our solidarity with Franco-Canadians. It'll always be very strong. So consultations led to a series of recommendations that we presented to the government. Obviously, we are in constant contact with the government. There are even representatives that appeared at committee and that followed the work and helped us formulate our recommendations. And this was important work so we can inform the minister and her team with respect to the bloc's needs and needs of the Quebec economy. And all of these recommendations that were presented need to be read and implemented with respect to the jurisdictions of the various provinces. It's an important aspect, and we need to remind the government to be careful when our political system was developed. We talked about a federation. It was a compromise that was reached because Sir John A. Macdonald and his friends wanted to have a legislative union where everything was decided in Ottawa, but we said no. If you want Quebec to participate in this, there has to be a parliament that is just as sovereign in their own jurisdiction. So what I've seen in the House since 2015, since I've been here, and what we saw before as well, there's a very strong trend on behalf of the government to always take on new powers and centralize power and decide everything. And this goes against the jurisdiction and the respect for my Quebec nation. So at the beginning of the report, we've reminded everyone of the importance of this, and all of these recommendations must be done respecting provincial jurisdiction. During questions that my colleague for Lac-Saint-Jean and myself asked the parliamentary secretary, well, we came back to one recommendation that is close to our hearts in the report that we're discussing today. It was adopted with a majority of members of the committee, including, of course, the Liberals. They recommend that the government enhance OAS for those aged from 65 to 74 years of age and annex it to take account of salary growth in Canada. In just a half hour, we're going to discuss my esteemed colleague from Shefford's legislation to enhance old age security for seniors aged 65 to 74 years. So what the Finance Committee has said in its report that we're discussing tonight is for the government, what we're suggesting support for this bill. It's very important. In fact, all parties did support this bill, but the problem is that the government has to give royal assent for this bill to continue to be studied. At the Bloc, under this government, which is now a minority government, we've said if you want to receive our support for the coming months, you have to support C-319 by giving it royal assent. It's very important. It's a question of dignity. So we're waiting impatiently for the government's response, which will allow us to know whether we're going to continue to work for the well-being of seniors and retired people in Quebec and across Canada in this House, or whether we'll hop onto our bus and the Liberals will have to face an election. So it's a choice the government has to make. So why seniors aged 65 to 74? Because the government enhanced OAS for seniors over 75 years of age. That's nice, but if it had been for 65 and up, I would have applauded this effort, but over 75, I can only half applaud this measure because only half of the work was done. And this creates sizable inequity that has to be remedied. Why do we want to enhance OAS? This is a support program that is federal. There aren't a lot of them, but this is their jurisdiction. And when the program was created, every year there was indexation based on the average salary over decades, but this didn't happen. And then we found we had a pension that was too low to meet basic needs and a minimum of dignity for seniors. So there's some catching up to do. It was done for those over 75, but there's still the seniors for 65 to 74 years of age. We've created 2 classes of seniors now. They have a right to dignity, and they don't recognize this right now. Why? This is unacceptable, particularly when we know that when you're 65 to 74 years of age, well, my parents are 71 and above, for example, your well-being and your financial security vary greatly from one person to another. So that's why we need a universal program that says, if you earn a lot of money, we'll take part of your OAS, you have enough money. But if you do have greater needs, we're here to support you. That's the idea of this social program. And that is why OAS should be indexed to average salaries and their increases so we can keep people's dignity. And in this age group, there can be people who had very physically demanding jobs and that can no longer be able to work. So they need rest that is well deserved. So we need to be there for them and for both him and her. And why do I say her? Because sometimes we have people who don't have a pension fund or a company pension plan. Why? It's often women, because often they need to, in our society, unfortunately, there's still great inequity, and often we ask the women to sacrifice herself for the well-being of others. And when parents are old and they need a support worker, often or a caregiver, it's the woman who leaves her job to take care of her parents, and during that time she does not collect Quebec pension support or other private pension support. And if her husband falls ill, she once again has to sacrifice her professional career to take care of him. And if there are children, etc., same thing. So very often it's women who do this, who make these sacrifices, and who aren't able to accumulate the retirement that they should have had. And OAS and other social programs should be there to support them. When we look at societal statistics, and women who are seniors who live alone, there's an overrepresentation of them who live in poverty. It's important to reestablish equity and justice, because very often they sacrifice themselves for the well-being of others. So we need a social safety net to rectify this. We're not going to turn our backs on them. We're going to give funding for those who are 65 to 75. We have to make up for the inflation, because OAS was not indexed to inflation or average salaries. It's a question of dignity. It's at the very heart of what the federal government has to do. So we're asking the government to do this. All parties supported this measure. It's up to the government now to grant royal assent, and the Bloc has made this a question of confidence and trust in our government. Are you here to help people who need you under your jurisdiction? You have a golden opportunity to show this. Our trust in the government will depend on this. Otherwise, I know, well, I'm the finance critic, and the Minister of Finance, like most of his colleagues, has a particular talent for boasting, congratulating people, creating good relationships, but often they're just burning time without really taking serious commitments or steps. But this is why our leader, with party officials, reminded everyone that we have set a deadline. If by October 29th this bill has not come into force, if it hasn't received royal assent and royal recommendation, we will work with the opposition to look at the confidence that we will grant or not to the government, because it is a question of dignity. And also, Madam Speaker, the Minister of Finance has said, yes, we said that this bill will cost $3 billion a year. Yes, it's a lot of money. It's expensive. But that's what governing is. We have to make choices. How do we allocate our resources? $3 billion a year is a lot. But the Trans Mountain Pipeline was $34 billion. and that was extremely expensive for a very highly polluting industry where companies are making astronomical record profits and they're great dividends. Canada needs to look at other economic interests. The oil and gas industry doesn't need our money, and they spent $34 billion. And for seniors, often single seniors over 65, they're saying $3 billion is too much. Who is the government working for? For the oil lobbyists or for those who really need support? This is the question we're asking, and the whole issue of Royal recommendation will give us an answer. I talked about the $34 billion for the Trans Mountain, and I was comparing this to the $3 billion per year that is needed to enhance OAS. I also want to talk about the Finance Minister's plan for what she calls a green economy. We're not being fooled. We know this government's nice word. Green economy means support to the fossil fuel industry. Her plan is $84 billion in coming years in various areas, but essentially we're talking about customized programs for oil and gas. They don't need state support because they are very profitable. They make record benefits every year. And the former Minister of the Environment, Ms. McKenna, explained a bit better than anyone else, this industry doesn't need support. $34 billion for Trans Mountain, $84 billion for various programs such as carbon capture. Does the industry need this money? The government has said yes. This is more important, $84 billion, than $3 billion for seniors, often single senior, female seniors who live alone, and they need this for just to have dignity. Governing is making choices, and the government, which is now a minority, needs to support us and stop serving the oil and gas industry, which is very profitable and doesn't need their support. Like we're suggesting with C319, which will be debated later, you need to take care of those who need your support in your areas of jurisdiction. It's very important. In terms of the $84 billion, there's carbon capture, and there's also help for nuclear reactors for oil sands to heat up the mud and save gas to be exported because it's very green with the new pipeline, or also it can be used to make hydrogen because in terms of these $84 billion, there's also adapted measures to transform gas to make hydrogen, and that can be exported. Is that their green vision for the future? Meanwhile, they're saying $3 billion a year for seniors in need, seniors who are age 65 to 74 is too much. And when you look at other OECD countries, other rich countries, the 30th richest countries, Canada is in roughly the worst situation with respect to the workforce and the retirement age. It's a replacement rate, they call it. Canada has seen the sharpest decrease in revenues between when you stop working and you receive your pension. We need to change that. How come Canada is doing so poorly? It's because we did not index social programs. The government has to ensure the dignity of its citizens in its areas of jurisdiction. And we know OAS is federal jurisdiction. Past governments and this government did not index it. So progressively they took away the necessary dignity for seniors, and the government tried to make things up for those over 75 years of age, but turned its back on other seniors aged 65 to 74.
So this is a matter of confidence for us and a matter of dignity, and the OECD reminds us that Canada has gotten way behind and is really a laggard in this area. And finally, Madam Speaker, there's the baby boomers who are retiring en masse, and the replacement rate is very low, their incomes are going to diminish, and that will have an indirect impact on the entire economy. What is their consumption rate? How much do they buy? If they have a decent income, they'll be able to purchase a certain amount and contribute to the smooth running of the economy. But if their purchasing power is too low, that could cause an economic slowdown. And I would invite everyone to look at the situation in Japan. In Japan, there's an aging population, more so than in other countries, but they managed more quickly to get into trouble because older people aren't buying new homes, new cars, and so on. They're cutting back on their spending. It's obviously a cultural choice, too, that's made, and that has led to economic slowdown, and that has caused poverty, and that has caused the entire economy of Japan to stagnate since the 90s. So let's look at Japan. It's a question of dignity, but it's also a question of the smooth running of the economy. So we want to avoid what happened to Japan. And once again, with each level of government operating within its areas of jurisdiction. So, and this is in support of our Bill C-319, which is about to be debated in exactly 18 minutes. So I'll stop there. But first of all, I'd like to raise one final point in the few minutes I have left. Another recommendation of the report has to do with supply management. That recommendation was supported by the government, and it reads as following. And the Liberal parties on the Finance Committee supported this motion that it calls for the government to offer up no more encroachments or breaches into supply management, and to no longer use supply management as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. So that's been through all the stages. It's before the Senate now, the other place, Madam Speaker. And let's hope they proceed swiftly to pass this. And hopefully the government and the elected Liberals here and their friends in the other place who don't sit very often, but they have a job to do too. That's, for once, it's an important job. And that is C-282, and they need to work swiftly, as did the Finance Committee, as is reflected in our report here. That needs to be implemented. For a long time, our farmers have been sold down the river in trade negotiations. They've been used as a bargaining chip or as pawns in trade negotiations. So we need to respect our farmers and respect supply management. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Questions and comments?
Center.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I know we're here because of conservative squabbles. I'd like to congratulate my colleague for Joliette, who took the time to discuss things that actually are important. So thank you for that. Also, he mentioned, Madam Speaker, that there are issues that are burning issues in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada. One issue that, in my opinion, is important is the $10 a day child care services. And thanks to that, there's been a historic increase in the number of women in the labor force. Is he concerned about the Conservatives' stand? The Conservatives would cut that program, which would do a disservice to women where he is and all across Canada. The Honourable Member for Joliette. Yes, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question, and especially for having asked it in French, for making that effort. It's highly appreciated, so I sincerely thank him for that. In Quebec, we have a family policy that came in the late 90s at a time when the Liberal government, the federal Liberal government, had cut transfers to the provinces. And in Quebec, people said, we're going to roll up our sleeves and go ahead with this. And we passed Pharmacare, which is far from perfect, but to support people who couldn't afford drugs. And there was a whole family policy with subsidized childcare and also the creation of child learning centers, early childhood learning and care centers. That was very powerful. That was in the late 90s, so over 25 years ago. So in Quebec, we didn't need to wait for Ottawa to follow suit. But obviously, this program means that the feds pay part of the share of what Quebec was already providing. And so it's a subsidy. And yes, we are concerned about that being cut. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. It was very, very interesting. But I'd like to come back to October 29th and the emphasis the Bloc is putting on that date. My colleague seems to be going even further with the ultimatum than his own leader. The Bloc leader appeared open to negotiations, whereas my colleague said quite clearly that if this is not settled by the 29th of October, they're going to pull the trigger on an election. My second question is, why October 29th? So currently with opposition days, well, there will be no more between now and then. So it'll be hard for any opposition party to trigger an election. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, member for Joliette. Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for Lévis-Lotbinière for those two questions. First of all, I think my leader was clear, and that was a good reflection of what I may have said here. Why October 29th? Well, we chose that date because there's 319 that's going to be debated later today, and then there's a committee study's already been done. After that, it goes to the Senate. So just to make sure everything's passed, that's why we gave that date for that. That's the analysis that was done of the bill's passage. And then I can't remember the other question. Shoot, I should have written it down. Oh, right. For opposition days, there's all kinds of ways of dealing with it, and so obviously, we're looking at that. Questions and comments?
Madam Speaker, first, I really appreciate my colleague. I've worked with him for many years, and he always comes to the House trying to bring forward ideas on tax fairness, and he's doing that again today. We know seniors are feeling the pinch when it comes to the housing crisis to inflation. Now, what's being proposed and what he's talking about in his speech is increasing, making sure that those that are 65 to 74 are getting the same benefit for the OAS from 65 and over. So we don't have a two-tiered seniors benefit, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate that. Now, when we look at the corporate tax rate back in 2015, the PBO calculated that it generated $2.6 billion per percent of tax for corporations. That would be roughly about $3 billion today. So that would equate to a 1% increase in corporate taxes. So instead of choosing corporate welfare, because we have the lowest corporate tax rate in the G7, well, how's that playing out, Madam Speaker? I'll tell you, big oil, big banks, big grocery are having record profits. Right. Meanwhile, seniors are living in poverty. So through you, Madam Speaker, would my colleagues support a 1% increase in corporate tax or a windfall tax on the big oil, big grocery, and big banks? Because we know that we did it to the big banks. It generated billions of dollars. There was a report done by the PBO that said big oil, if we did the same taxation, would generate $4.2 billion, Madam Speaker. So through you, Madam Speaker, I'll wait for my colleague to give me his thoughts.
The honourable member for Joliette. Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague, the honourable member for Courtenay Alberni. I think he's an outstanding member who works for people, works for the people, for people who are having difficulties, and social justice is a concern for him. You could see that in his question. Here in the House, my fight is against tax havens. How can we make those illegal? They're immoral already, but how do we make them illegal? And when you look at all the fine print in the regulations and so on, well, banks get away with paying less tax by virtually hiding their profits in the Caribbean or elsewhere. It's unacceptable. And we need fairness across the economy and across society. For example, oil companies are making record profits, and at the same time, there is a huge problem of poverty in this country. So the question is, how do we redistribute the wealth? And the Scandinavian countries have shown us the way. The more you redistribute the wealth, the better it is for everyone, and it stimulates the economy. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Rimouski, Neigette, Témiscouata, Les Basques. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to give a I'd like to commend my colleague for Joliette on his speech. His speeches are always very well structured, and it shows here. And I think I think we can see the confidence that other members of other parties place in him. So increasing the OAS is a bit of a rallying cry for us. You know, in my area, there are a lot of people. Within 20 years, it'll be 1 in 3 people fall into that demographic. So that the wave of retirements will hit my area before other parts of Quebec. So it's a question of respect and also gratitude towards our seniors who built this country. So I'd like my colleague to remind us how important it is to increase the old age security for all seniors, particularly those between 65 and 74 who are being discriminated against currently. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for Rimouski, Témiscouata-les-Basques, who does an excellent job representing his constituents. And I'd also like to commend him on all the work he does here in the House. He raises a very important point. First of all, there's a high number of seniors in his riding, which is a rural riding. So there's a large number of people who are 65 and older in his riding. So there's a whole issue, too, of land use, of population density. So in rural areas, we recognize that there are more seniors proportionately than in cities. So if we make life more difficult, if we push seniors into poverty, is it going to mean that they can't continue to live out in the countryside? That's going to affect our population patterns. There's time for one last quick question. I'll remember for Saint-Jean, Lac Saint-Jean. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much. Today, my leader asked the Prime Minister to tell us how important C-282 was, the supply management bill, to the Liberals. And the Liberal leader said that he had promised farmers that he would no longer jeopardize supply management in trade negotiations. So my question is, what's the difference between the Prime Minister's promise and C-282? The Honourable Member for Joliette, a very quick answer. Yes, when the Prime Minister makes a promise like that, when he undertakes to do something like that, we want to believe him, but if he changes his mind, there's nothing to be done about it. But if there's legislation, then if the government wanted to change its mind, they would have to introduce new legislation and they would run up against the farmers. Good luck.
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the federal government's 2024-25 budget included an important reform to the taxation of capital gains, something that has been called for by progressive voices in this country for decades, and that is to change the way we tax capital gains. Now, capital gains occur when an asset is sold for more than it costs to acquire and maintain. Now, there's a number of very important exceptions to this rule, including Canadians' principal residences and other types of assets. Capital gains generally are heavily concentrated among high-income Canadians, more so than any other form of income. Making matters worse, they benefit from lucrative tax preferences. Until this year and this change, recipients only had to declare half their capital gains on their income tax. That's the so-called inclusion rate of 50%. The other half was entirely tax-free. So if you bought an asset, like a second home or a building or stocks for $500,000 and you sold it for $1 million, half of that $500,000 profit was completely tax-free. In contrast, other forms of incomes like wages and salaries must be fully reported on a tax return. I think Canadians are well aware of that. In other words, the inclusion rate for salaries and wages is 100%. Now think of that, Madam Speaker. Teachers, waitresses, firefighters, truck drivers, plumbers, office workers, cleaners. Pretty much every person who goes to work every day and has a job has to declare 100% of their income and pay tax on 100% of that. But not people who are trading stocks or selling secondary residences or large assets. For them, they only have to declare half of their profit, and the other half goes in the pocket tax-free. So the federal budget announced a change in the capital gains inclusion rate. As of June 24th of this year, it rose to 66.7% for capital gains inclusion declared by corporations. That means that for corporations, instead of sheltering 50% of their profits, they could now only shelter 1/3, but they still get to shelter 1/3 of their profits. The inclusion rate for individuals remains at 50%,